provocateur.media.
By saying that, he's erasing everybody who was involved. If he had said, and I think it would be perfectly reasonable and valid and frankly good, and to have mentioned the Jewish people, to have mentioned Roma, people who were gay and lesbian, people who were disabled, political dissidents. He could have mentioned all those people and had them at least feel heard. So on a day that's supposed to be for remembrance of the people who suffered in the Holocaust, it would be nice if he remembered that they existed, remembered enough to at least mention the groups by name.
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater Dubé, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater Dubé, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
It's episode number 7 of the Goldwaters. I am your moderator, Dan Delmar, and it's my pleasure to reintroduce the Goldwaters to you. Met Anne-France Goldwater, senior partner at Goldwater Dubé and political commentator, Dr. Samantha Goldwater-Adler, clinical psychologist, and met Daniel Goldwater, attorney as well at Goldwater Dubé, here to chat about current events, societal issues, and a lot more around the breakfast table. And Goldwaters, welcome, and thank you for preparing, again, a lovely schmear for our team. We really appreciate that, the lox and the cream cheese. It's very, very Goldwater.
Well, thank you for translating what a schmear means.
Would you like to explain what a schmear is? A lovely
It's
Hebrew
the schmear that we put on the bagel is the cream cheese, but we sort of use it collectively to refer to the heavy Sunday morning brunch that we all like to eat.
Let's get on to the topic of this week's episode, and it's empathy. This is something that I think a lot of people don't give a tremendous amount of thought to, so we're going to delve into a more, I guess, conceptual topic today. So let's start with this. Is empathy anything that you've considered in your personal and professional life? Do you take a look at your own empathy? And who would you say has the most empathy in the Goldwater clan?
I wouldn't be prepared to rank any of us on empathy. I think we're all hopefully empathic and experience it and express it in our own ways. I can say definitely for myself and in my practice, I've worked hard to cultivate empathy directly and compassion specifically. And even because in order to, most of my job, at least the way that I conceive it, is in being able to really connect with people and the people that are coming to me with difficulties. And some of the people are coming to me, some of my clients, they come to me and they tell me things that they've done, particularly clients that have issues with anger management. And sometimes they say things or they do things that are really hurtful to other people. And in that I would have perhaps a visceral kind of gut reaction of, wow, that's messed up. I can't believe you did that. Or a visceral othering of the person. Say, well, you are not the same type of person as me and I should see you as a bad person and shun you. And in my practice, it's obviously not a helpful position to adopt. And I've worked really hard to be able to see the shared humanity in all of us and to be able to really to experience their emotions and see where they're coming from and really try to understand and accept it, even if I don't accept the behavior that they've engaged in. And frankly, I think that it's been really important for me and for my mental health, because I find that even in times where I've gotten OD'd on reading the news, let's say, and seeing all the horrible things that are happening in the world, and there's times where my mind can go to a really dark place and get to the othering, like other people, there's bad people in the world. And once I get to that place, I find it difficult to function. And I find for myself, personally, for my practice and for my family and as a human, I need to view people with empathy and with compassion.
I noticed that, Samantha, you evaded answering the question. I'll take a stab at it as to the ranking of...
The ranking?
The piquant question. I would say Samantha has the most empathy.
Oh, phooey to that.
Oh, it's obvious.
I win, you guys. All right, podcast done. I win.
You win.
That's it.
You win. You're the most empathic and the most gloating.
Right.
But
which makes me even more empathic to gloat about it.
Well, you are the parentified child in this. You're the firstborn, so I guess maybe it makes some sense. Who knows? I would say my mother is second ranking. I think it's a bit more intense, her version of empathy, for better and for worse. But I've definitely benefited from it in our relationship. And I would say, that leaves me, I guess, not to be
the psychopath sitting
Yeah.
Well,
across
yeah,
the
no,
table.
I am male, so I guess I'll take it as a macho thing. But maybe I have the most compassion.
Whoa! I think he just went up to us somehow. I feel like
I don't know, man. I'd challenge that.
You would.
I
Okay,
would.
so let's put this into context. First of all, you are the children of your father. Your father was a high school teacher for over 35 years, and he was the type of high school teacher who considered it a capital crime for a teacher ever to call a child stupid. Because if you're in a position of authority to a teenager and you call that child stupid, you make the child believe he's stupid. And and one of the few times I ever saw your father angry in his entire life, a man who never raised his voice, was when another teacher had done that. The high school he was teaching at had called a kid stupid, and he thought that teacher should be kicked out. That's like an absolute no-go. He was the type of fellow that if there was and still is, a spider in the house, he would gently lift up the spider in his hand and take the spider outside and put the spider on the lawn, because he's just not the type of person who'd kill a spider. So you come from stock, as they say, good stock, where compassion and empathy, I guess we should discuss the differences, are part of what you were raised with. Certainly now I'm at a stage, I can't believe I'm saying, I've been a divorce lawyer over 35 years, and I think a big part of the skill that I have is listening to my clients and being that empathic ear and understanding what they're feeling. I certainly feel for you, Samantha, because I've experienced the same thing, that when you are if you are really capable of feeling empathy and sort of grokking, which is more than just understanding cognitively, but grokking, understanding emotionally, feeling emotionally what your client feels, that can sometimes put you in a bad position when you're feeling the client's distress or the client's anger or the client's desire to lash out at his or her spouse. And I remember attending a conference given by a psychologist on treating sex offenders. And it was one of the things the organizer of the conference cautioned all the psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers in the room, be careful of your own empathy, because sometimes it can create in you feelings of violence and sexual aberration if you feel too much empathy, and it becomes the patient taking you to his dark place.
I wonder if that's more emotional contagion than empathy.
We'll get to the effectiveness of empathy, especially when it comes to policy. So let's start there. And we're talking, of course, we've talked a lot about Trump on the podcast and an increasingly unstable world where should governments consider empathy as part of decision making? There seems to be less empathy available these days to people in distress, like refugees, for example. Can we be empathetic and remain impartial and productive when we are in positions of authority, and can we do this effectively?
It depends on the mandate, I think, Dan. I mean, you're talking about government, right? So the mandate is to represent the people they represent, to empower them to hold office. So they're not exactly empowered or tasked with having empathy, say, for people in other countries, right? Unless self-interest happens to overlap there, right? It's always struck me in the nativist movements that we're seeing around the world, immigrants took our jobs and all that stuff, where it's always like, okay, but someone else got the job. Good for him or her. So that's my automatic thought. What do you think, Ma?
I'm kind of stunned by that take. As I view it, empathy is almost counterindicated for leaders, people in position of authority, because you have to engage in an exercise that goes contrary to how the human brain is built, but you have to do it. Empathy is precisely the wrong feeling to have, because you will drown in the misery of the thousands or the millions of people that you are trying to lead. And amongst the thousands or millions or the tens or hundreds of millions of people you're trying to lead, there are going to be people with different degrees of suffering who are in conflict with each other. And one man's great victory and success is a cause of another man's suffering. Like the great entrepreneur who's come up with this company called Otto, O-T-T-O, and he's landed his first contract to permit the delivery of 50,000 cans of beer between whatever two cities. Let's say it was San Francisco and LA. In my mind, I'm putting it in California, of course, wherever it actually is. And so his joy and the success for him, the workers in his company and his investors, it can be a death knell for the truckers who were then trucking those beer cans from the one city to the other, lose their jobs and lose their homes. So you can't judge, you can't lead by empathy. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why there's a huge distinction between empathy and compassion. And I think that takes us, for me, the core of this whole problem. Empathy, compassion, sympathy, apathy, all these different traits is trying to deal with how the mind is wired. And I think that as we were talking about this before coming to this podcast, I noticed we all have some pretty different perspectives on how we perceive our brains to be hardwired to communicate and understand what other people are feeling, individuals and larger numbers.
I think that, and in this way, I disagree. I think that a lot of times in government and when we're making decisions, not every decision is a zero-sum game. So not every decision is going to be, the good of the employees of this company versus truckers, the good of truckers and associated industries. A lot of decisions, can lift all of us or can lift at least a significant group of us and not necessarily affect others.
But those are the easy ones, Samantha.
Sure, one would hope. But I think that empathy still does come into play, and I think that it shouldn't be the sole factor affecting decisions. I think there's a little bit of a false dichotomy in the way that we're thinking about this, that you make decisions either with empathy or with rationality. I think, frankly, it's foolish to make decisions solely based on either. I think there's a middle ground. And I think that empathy is it's an innate emotion, it's an important emotion, it's an emotion that connects us to others. Well, literally, it's something that in our brains, maybe let's define empathy for the audience as we're getting into this, because we're throwing around these terms, and oftentimes in daily speak, we kind of mix them up. We'll say empathy, sympathy, compassion, and we treat them as though they're equivalent, even though they're not. So let's just say very basically, what is empathy? Empathy is sharing the emotion of someone else. It's feeling the same emotion as another person, while still recognizing that it is the other person's emotion.
Some of us use the more scholarly term Einfühlung, because Einfühlung, which is the German, means to feel into.
Oh, you stole my observation. Mind you, to add to it, though, yes. The German word einfühlen, into feeling, empathy is the Greek translation of the German word. In pathos, so in feeling. So the only distinction, I guess, to make, besides being like a little schoolmarmy and pedantic here, is that it's, in a German sense, it's into. So it's like an ongoing process, whereas empathy is in, so that you're in it in a static way. It's not
I don't agree. No, I don't agree. I think the whole point is the ability to get out of yourself into the other person's skin, not just for cognitive appreciation, but to share the feelings, the different part of the brain, the limbic system. And I think, and this is where I challenge right away the utility of empathy beyond the small scale. If you consider your average mom and pop shop of anything in North America, whatever type of shop it is, a little pharmacy, a little, what we call dépanneurs, what do you call it, corner groceries. The biggest selling items are alcohol and cigarettes. So the biggest source of profitability and therefore comforts and are for very small businesses come from two of the most toxic products known to mankind. Now, if I'm a ruler of the country and I'm going to have all this huge empathy for all these small mom and pop businesses, that would compel me to think I should have as unrestricted a possible sale of alcohol and cigarettes and God knows what else, maybe heroin, maybe napalm, whatever toots people's horns. I mean, in the United States, guns, man, they're thrilled to be able to buy guns at the corner store. But as a leader, I should put empathy aside, and I have to look at cold things like statistics, and I have to look at numbers, and I have to look at how many people are killed each year because people drive drunk or drive impaired or intoxicated or drugged. I have to look at the death toll caused by guns. I think empathy is what screws up the United States. They're so caught up in the emotionality of their historic traditions as a warrior people or as a bunch of cowboys that it's too emotional for them to lose their guns. Whereas if they had coldly rational leaders who would sit there and look at the death toll caused by guns, homicides and suicides alike, you'd ban guns, in Canada.
But people aren't motivated by rationality. They don't feel a sense of connection from rationality, and they don't have a sense of community from rationality. Empathy is a fundamental connecting emotion. It enables us to feel the plight and the suffering of others and feel connected to them and feel motivated to do something about it. And I think that that's really important. A lot of the examples that you're using are a matter of the beam of focus. So yes, if we are applying our empathy only to a select group of people at the expense of everybody else, then yes, we can start making decisions that could be actively harmful to the people that we're not looking at. And in fact, cognitively, in terms of research, the research does show that inherently we do tend to feel more empathy for people that we identify with, from people that we see as being part of our, the term that we use is in-group. But there are ways to, a lot of those constructs are society,
they're innate, Samantha.
No,
they're innate.
They're absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're absolutely not, because we can train empathy, and it's just false. And they've actually done studies on this, that people that are more prejudiced have greater difficulties empathizing with people that they don't identify as part of their in-group, people that they see as others, that you can train it in very, very simple ways, even just by priming people, by saying just a simple, hey, people in your group tend to be super empathic and really compassionate. Hey, check out these videos. And then the empathy gap starts to disappear entirely.
But you don't need it. But I view it, listen, it's awesome to know how to ride a bike and to swim. I can ride a bike, I can't swim, I'm still having a full life. I'm answering Dan's question. Dan's question is the utility of empathy in governance. And I think that many of the qualities you're describing, I do not deny not only the utility, but I would hope the innate skill that we have, that we can develop and hone to be empathic towards others. There's a reason why when a newspaper reporter starts writing about, let us say, an earthquake in Mexico, the story is never about the intensity of the earthquake or the number of people killed or the number of dollars of damage caused. It never starts like that. It starts with the story of Manuela. Manuela was on her way to work. Her children, Jose and Maria. Let me finish. Her children, Jose and Maria, she dropped them off at school. She just got to the door of the building. The building started to shake. She threw herself to the ground. The building fell. She was injured in the rubble. She started to cry.
And then what?
Why?
And then what? What happened after the Manuel? I'm really into this.
That's how newspaper stories are written, and there's a reason, because we can only relate to the suffering of people from 1 to about 5 or 10 people at a time. That's how the brain is wired. You will note that you are more likely to give a donation. I'm sure we all read about that little dog in Toronto, Cupid, who was born with a congenital defect. He has no front legs, and he was tossed in the garbage by some wonderful, disgusting human. And the Canadian community has come together to make donations for this little dog who's called Cupid, was a Cupid-shaped nose, and to provide him prosthetic limbs and so on. Why? Because we relate to the story of the one dog. We can't relate to the story to the tens of thousands who are euthanized every day across North America for no reason but the convenience of owners.
I'm going to try to split the difference here and be the ref, but I think I'm going to pile up a little bit on you, Samantha.
I know.
You know it.
I know it's coming.
Well, no, because I think Mom's point is that it comes down to scope, right? I mean, it comes down to, in our wheelhouse, we're in helping professions, right? We represent individuals. We don't necessarily represent institutions, right? So an empathy ability or a strength will serve us perhaps well in that, because we're representing one person. And in governance, where the more people there are, empathy doesn't necessarily serve you that well. I mean, it depends on the governance, of course. Are you governing a Rotary Club of 10 people or a nation of 10 million? It really depends. But you have to balance the empathy.
I agree. I think you need to balance the empathy, but I don't think you should get rid of it entirely or say that's completely unnecessary. I think that what's important, even if you're in a position of governance, let's say your mandate is to help the people in your community, or that you're in your community, then it's important to have some. I would hope that the people in government frankly give a crap about the people in their community and what their experiences are and what their suffering is and what their needs are. And I would hope that they would keep that in mind. And I think a lot of the examples that you're using of the failures of empathy are when we apply it at too narrow a scope, when we just say, well, I'm only going to be concerned about these two shop owners and my neighbor, but I'm not going to be concerned about other people in the community that are involved or other people that may be affected by my decisions. And I think it's important whenever, I'll give you an example. So in psychology, when we the way I was taught this is that when we're presented with an ethical dilemma, there's certain steps that we need to go through in order to resolve the ethical dilemma. And one of the steps in resolving the ethical dilemma is to consider each of the people or groups that would be affected or may be affected by our decision, and to consider how each of those people or groups may be affected by our decision.
And
then
why
to
is
use
that? But wait, why is that not a cognitive exercise? Why is it the more primitive part of our brain is somehow elevated to having some type of super quality because it's emotional and hence irrational, should somehow be elevated to a level that would transcend the cognitive part of our brain, where we actually think and analyze and study, and we don't make decisions purely based on how our intestines turn on the moment.
Why is this discussion about solely based on empathy? It's that I've said this like 10 times over, that it shouldn't be solely based on empathy. It should be a consideration. And you're also making a false dichotomy, because there is such a thing as cognitive empathy, which is also compassion. A thing. No, that's not compassion.
So what's compassion?
Okay, let's find the specific definition of compassion. Compassion is more action-oriented than empathy in terms of as a feeling, as an emotion. It's whereas empathy is, I feel your suffering, I feel your pain, I share it. With compassion, it's, I want to relieve your suffering. It's, I feel what you feel, and it doesn't overwhelm me, and I'm motivated to take action to alleviate.
Wait, I want to push back
suffering.
on this, because where did you get that definition, Samantha? Is that from the realm of psychology, or is it just what the word means? Because words have different meanings in different disciplines. I think you understand that. And if you actually look at the etymology, it's for true. What, am I saying something controversial? No.
The testosterone rises again.
It's hard to understand. Would you mind explaining it to me in simpler terms and a little bit more slowly?
I have like pink and purple slides here.
Wait. Pink, purple? This is confusing. You lost me.
No, the point I was trying to make is that if you just look to the word itself, I found it very touching, in fact, that passion, if you look in etymological dictionary, really refers to suffering, and it refers to, in fact, good old Jesus Christ, the passion of the Christ. In Christianity, it's very much focused on suffering, right? I mean, the crucifix is the symbol, right? And the only point I'm trying to make is that the word has a meaning. The word has a meaning before the professionals got their hands on it and put their imprint on it. And it means suffering, and compassion means to suffer with. That's all the word means. So I think that there's this strange sort of heuristic sort of game that's going on here in a lot of different disciplines to say, oh no, that's empathy, this is sympathy, that's compassion. It's like the words mean what they mean. Why is everyone trying to reinvent it to kind of get more clicks?
I have to take exception to this, Daniel. It's no matter how we parse the words and whether we consider that we should attach certain nuances to different kinds of feelings, the differences between sympathy or empathy and compassion. At the end of the day, the part that I'm underscoring is that there's a hidden trap. There's a trap for people in all the helping professions, whether you're a school teacher or a daycare worker, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a doctor, certainly whether you're a psychologist or an attorney, obviously in family law, that wouldn't apply if you do commercial law, and let's say for social workers too. All kinds of these professions. You're interacting with individuals who are in distress. And the natural and noble faculty of empathy, for some people who might parse this as sympathy, for others who parse it as compassion, can be terribly self-defeating. I remember being a young attorney, and I would be handling cases of sexual assault of a wife of a woman or of one of the children, youth protection cases where a child had been beaten, kidnapping cases where perhaps a mother had kidnapped the children to prevent the father from seeing them. And handling these cases, I would come home, I wouldn't sleep at night, I would have nightmares, I would cry, and I would cry just as much in the cases that I won as the cases that I lost, because it's the intensity of the sharing of the emotion of what has happened that can debilitate you. So I think that as social animals, we're hardwired to feel a degree, or most of us, I guess we should talk about the people who aren't the psychopaths, but I think we're hardwired to feel a degree of mutuality and understanding of other people's emotions. But I think as communities become larger and as we live more closely together, as we have to interact and deal with more people than we ever had to as a species, where your entire tribe might be 30 people, I think that we have to find ways to the contrary to put limits on these natural emotional reactions and try to use the parts of our brain that are able to cope with more abstractions to keep a certain distance. I mean, think of all the physicians who have to work in a palliative care unit. Think of the pediatric oncologists who have to deal with dying children every day. If you felt perfect empathy, you'd burn out in 3 months.
I think there's different issues that you're touching on. I think that, yes, there is such a thing as compassion fatigue and burnout, and in the helping professions, it's a thing, and it can be really debilitating. But I see empathy as being the starting point for action rather than the end point. And yes, in the case of just pure empathy, devoid of reason and devoid of action, it can be certainly paralyzing and overwhelming and frankly not entirely helpful. If I'm dealing with a client and I'm acutely feeling their pain, and it's such an intensity that I'm not thinking anymore about what action I can take for the client, and I'm not thinking anymore about, what are the things that could really be helpful for this person, then yeah, I'm useless at that point. There's a certain, I can still share that connection and that may be helpful, but I'm no longer in the helping role once I'm just sitting there in the same emotion as the client without any action. That
Bingo.
said,
it interferes with your cognition and your ability to apply your professional skills to assist the person. And I think the same thing applies if you're a president or a prime minister.
No.
Too much feeling dulls the brain.
No, because you're still saying too much. You and Daniel keep presenting this as there's some sort of dichotomy, that it's either empathy or rationality. Empathy is the start point. It's how you feel that initial connection. It's how you feel that motivation to then take action. The action, of course, is important, and the action in psychobabble, because apparently, because there's real words, Daniel, that have a definition in the dictionary, and then psychology just take words and just twist them and make them up and turn them into something other than what they are. But okay, let's say in psychology-led.
For the listener, that's my daughter being sarcastic and having her revenge on her little brother. She succeeded. 1 Samantha, 0 Daniel.
But yes, that's part of the difference once empathy kind of shifts into compassion, is that it's more action-oriented. So I think that empathy is still an extremely important start point. I would hope that I never get to the place in my practice that I ever have no empathy for my clients, because if there's a point where I feel that profound disconnection from them, I need to quit, because I'm not I'm not forming alliance with them. I'm not as motivated to help them. And I lose a certain perspective. And to your broader point, when you're getting into, as a society, that we're dealing with more and more and more people, and so it becomes harder to just, tap into our inherent empathy for other monkeys that look like us and nobody else. I don't think that the answer is thereby to shut down empathy. The answer is to consider the interests of other parties involved and to expand the empathy rather than to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Just to be clear, I never presented it as an either-or thing, and I agree wholeheartedly with everything you just said, that it's a process. All I was trying
Samantha, two, Daniel, no, I'm kidding.
It's not a fight.
It's not a fight.
Have some empathy, please.
I'm too busy feeling compassionate, Daniel.
Or just trying to one-up. But that being said...
Two-up. She's two-upping you.
No, all I was trying to emphasize is that the word compassion, you're saying that's action-oriented, and I'm just trying to say, yeah, but it's still not an action. And to do a little shout-out to our firm, we do have a motto. It goes passion, compassion, tenacity. there is a step after that perhaps my mother was, in a sense, advocating for, that there's also steeling yourself, and to do something, you have to kind of have a thick skin as well. Compassion comes before the decision.
Yes, but
Wow,
it's important.
wait,
But it's an important
I
prerequisite.
I love our words. But I think that Daniel's shout out to you, Samantha, is quite to that point, and I think really validates and underscores the legitimacy of what you're saying, is that you have to have that foundational connection to get to the next part, to get to tenacity. I know certainly what drives me to want to win cases. You know, at the end of the day, I'm paid the same if I win or lose, as long as I'm doing the job properly. But what gives me the real drive to want to win the case is that basic desire that my client be well, that I do something that alleviates his distress, that puts his best case forward, that gives him the best outcome, so he can, so however a bad position he or she has started in, at the end of his case, he or she has an improved lot in life and finds happiness again.
So guys, as Samantha was saying earlier, there are studies that show that we are more empathetic towards those within our in-group, our cultural group, even our own sports team, our sports tribe. So does that make empathy at least always a little bit inherently xenophobic?
I don't view it as xenophobic. I think that empathy is inherently tribal, not for a bad reason, but for the good reason, which is the millennia over which it evolved. In the time frame over which this evolved as an adaptive trait for humans, it evolved where your group, your peeps, your group was a small group of people who looked like you, smelled like you, acted like you, and ate the same food.
No, I don't think it's about xenophobia as much as it's preferential to people that look like you. So it's not exactly that you're fearful of others as much as you are protective or identifying with people that are similar to you.
Well, I think that it's important that, and in the spirit of empathy as muscle, I think it's something that inherently we do tend to, as we say, prefer our in-group. And there's all sorts of ways that we're trained as we grow up to view who is our in-group. Who are the people that are like us, and we say people that look like us, but frankly, it could easily be triggered by saying something as simple as, oh, that person has curly hair, you have curly hair. And then, oh, okay, all of a sudden that person is now in my in-group. Or, oh, that person went to the same school as you did, even if they are, even if I'm looking at a 6'5" Chinese gentleman, well, he went to the same school I did, all of a sudden he's part of my in-group, even if otherwise I wouldn't necessarily have identified with him. And I think that empathy is something that can be trained. And to your point, Mom, I think that it's something that, through our education and as we're growing up, I think it's important to be able to give our children and to really encourage ourselves to try to empathize with people that we normally wouldn't.
But here's the problem as I see it. I did a certain amount of criminal law when I was a younger attorney, and I enjoyed it. I found it a very intellectual domain, but it wasn't very compatible with family law. And certainly I learned very important concepts in the criminal law, including that when you see some of the patients that you've had, Samantha, these adolescents, young adults, let's say kids 15 to 25, I'll put it all the way to 25 for scientific reasons, not legal reasons, and you recognize that the human brain is not fully mature, and the more punitive the justice system is with these young offenders who usually come from very abusive and inadequate backgrounds, the more likely you are to fabricate a career criminal rather than rehabilitate this young adult, this teenager and young adult. Certainly that's led us to develop different criminal justice systems. So, for instance, for adolescents, we focus very much on rehabilitation in Quebec, and other provinces that sometimes have different politicians in charge, right, will take a more punitive approach, even though the science says it doesn't work. But then I realize that the politicization or the social discussion based on emotional reactions is really beside the point. It's really beside the point, because the truth is you could have compassion for a 15-year-old who was abused as a child or for a 35-year-old who was abused as a child. But you need to have a society where it's safe to walk down the street. You need to have a safe society, and there are some people that you will need to imprison. And it seemed, not that I think imprisoning is the ultimate solution, but we're not fully there in science. We've done better with rehabilitation of adolescents than with adults. More power to us that we have the wit not to be so punitive with young people, but we're not fully there. And it seems to me it's not empathy that's going to solve the problem for beans. It's science and studies and research. For instance, the prison programs where they provide pets to inmates. And they do this with violent criminals, and they teach them how to take care of an animal. And it is surprising how you cultivate empathy in these violent prisoners by giving them somebody to take care of.
But part of it is that those programs can only be put in place if you view those violent criminals as people, and if you feel connected with them, and if you feel their plight to some extent. And in terms of what action then to take, well, the question becomes, well, what's effective? But I think that part of the issue is that empathy acts as a natural brake on hurting other people. And as soon as you lack empathy, then you start to view other people as objects. And it starts to be a way to be able to commit really cruel and heinous acts against them. That's why I think it's always important, even when we're dealing with the most violent members of our society, to really be able to experience, at least as a start point, that they are humans and that they share their blood runs red just as ours do, and that they feel emotions just like we do, and they have suffering and pain just like we do.
I'm not debating it. I just really don't feel that's necessary. As a person who will never renounce to her empathy in terms of dealing with other people, I don't even feel a desire to experience empathy for murderers and child killers and pedophiles. But I do have a scientific desire, if I were looking at it from a perspective of governance, to find ways to rehabilitate these people so that when their sentence is finished and their debt to society is paid, and this is training I have from my father, when a man's debt to society is paid, he should be reaccepted into the community from which he comes with as much love and respect and empathy as when he was first condemned for his crime.
Scientific
and not do what
desire.
we do.
I like scientific
You like
desire. That's going to be my new hashtag. Scientific desire. How rousing.
I think it'd make a great band name.
Rousing or arousing? With you, Daniel?
No, just rousing.
Just rousing. Okay.
Let's get to examples of empathy, or perhaps a lack of empathy, at a serious policy level. So a few weeks ago in the States, it was Holocaust Remembrance Day, and the Trump administration famously edited out references to Jews because they would argue perhaps that this was an example of empathy-free policy making, of cold reason, and acknowledging that there were many victims of the Holocaust. Is this an example of where policy could use a fair more amount of empathy?
I think that part of it in that situation is that they didn't mention any groups that were targeted by the Holocaust. And so by saying, it seems kind of backwards to me to say, well, we didn't mention Jews because other people were affected as well, so we didn't mention anybody. What is that? It seems like their lack of empathy for other people, they used empathy to justify their lack of empathy. It seems somehow backwards to me.
Well, no, if your premise, Dan, is that they were trying to make a statement crafted in cold rationality, I think rationality escapes our president, needless to say.
Our president?
My God, our president. I'm watching too much CNN, aren't I? Yeah, I live in Canada. I am a Canadian. Phew.
We have the pot-smoking snowboarder who says all the nice things.
Yeah, the topless guy. I think, to the contrary, it was a false empathy that President Trump tried to convey when he said, and believe it or not, I'm quoting the man, "Together we will make love and tolerance prevalent throughout the world," end quote. Pinch me, I'm dreaming. I'm surprised people didn't burst out laughing from coast to coast. This is the man who bullies people night and day, from that creepy way he looks at Melania and Ivanka, his daughter wife, and the way he abuses women. Elizabeth Warren now, she looks like Pocahontas, and Rosie O'Donnell, the pig. I mean, the man is a predator, a Hitler, a hateful man.
Well, obviously, anything that comes out of Trump's mouth, like I take it as this man said it, I don't like this man. Okay, I'm past that. But if I take the statement as on its own merits, And I understand it's in a context, and I have no doubt it was crafted with political ends in mind to appeal to a white base. But once I get past that, and I just actually think of the sentiment and the words as they're written, there is a reality that there were other victims.
Okay, so all of this really begs the question as to how Jews themselves notably feel now, especially those who voted for Trump, and must certainly feel betrayed by his failure to commemorate them by name. No?
Well, let's also not forget that the man does have Jewish grandchildren. In fact, I think all his kids have married into the married Jewish people, I think I'm correct on that.
He has his son-in-law and his daughter-in-law.
And I do think
2 out of 3.
And I do think while we're talking about empathy and maybe preferring people that are like you or part of your team or your tribe, he's kind of part of that tribe in a way. He really is. His own kin. There's a reality there. I do think that his words about his support for Israel, I do think it comes from maybe a selfish place. It comes from him. It does come from him. And I think that it's... And I just find it interesting that a lot of Jewish liberals and progressives that I know, I don't know how they deal with this, because a lot of them, I think, are suspicious of his intentions when he says that he's Zionist. But I mean, I believe him. I take it at face value. I just think that it might be, in his vulgar way, exaggerated and sort of another perversion of empathy that is going on in his own head. But I don't see him as other. In fact, I see him as close to my tribe. I see him as somebody. He's flesh and blood. He's a human being, and I have to tell you, his whole life story. I have a lot of empathy for him. The guy had a tyrant of a father. His older brother, who he looked up to, died of alcoholism because he couldn't hack it in the business and maybe had other hopes and aspirations. The man has a lot of trauma. Now, it's not to say I don't want to punch him in the face and that I don't hate his policies and all those things, but I can juggle those two feelings.
I think one of the issues, though, even as you're getting into Donald Trump and into Holocaust Remembrance Day and what he said, yes, I'm sure he has his own baggage, and it's worth having, to as a start point, have some empathy for him and consider that he's coming from a certain place. Sure. It calls to mind the expression, with friends like him,
Who needs enemies?
And I think part of the issue is that, yes, he may be courting Zionists and have grandchildren, have his daughter converted, and have grandchildren who are Jewish. But I think he's also been courting the white nationalist anti-Semite vote. And I think that that's a fundamental tension that needs to be acknowledged. And besides that, to go back to the original point, which is his statement on Holocaust Remembrance Day that didn't mention the Jewish people, and then his response that, well, there's other people that were killed in the Holocaust, I think that by saying that, he's erasing everybody who was involved. If he had said, and I think it would be perfectly reasonable and valid and frankly good, and to have mentioned the Jewish people, to have mentioned Roma, people who were gay and lesbian, people who were disabled, political dissidents. He could have mentioned all those people and had them at least feel heard. So on a day that's supposed to be for remembrance of the people who suffered in the Holocaust, it would be nice if he remembered that they existed, remembered enough to at least mention the groups by name. And by making them completely invisible,
Here.
and then by people then commenting and saying, hey, by the way, that really sucked that you made me invisible. I said, well, it's not that you're invisible. It's just you're not the most important person here. Other people matter too. Other people I didn't mention either. It's profoundly hurtful, and it erases that history and that cultural trauma.
And evidences his total lack of empathy. And I think our next podcast is going to be on psychopathy. We can call it Ode to Donald J. Trump.
I think you mean narcissism, but sure.
But speaking of psychopathy, narcissism, considered in some circles to be good qualities in a leader, or at least good qualities perhaps in certain business circles, more likely to succeed in some cases. I've seen this argument. So let's end on this question of leadership. And are the most successful leaders in the business world or in other settings completely devoid of empathy?
Well, something I certainly didn't expect as a young woman growing up as rather right-wing and quite capitalist-oriented and, an avid reader of the works of Ayn Rand, not just her novels, but her nonfiction work, is to my great surprise as an attorney, I've met quite a number of successful businessmen and I'm putting the emphasis on all syllables here. And I have to say, I'm quite stricken by the number of successful businessmen who have, first of all, I'm in no position to diagnose, but who certainly have traits, manifest traits that are associated with psychopathy. And including notably the lack of empathy, the real sort of blank face, not getting it when somebody else cries. I've seen people do that who literally just don't react. If their children, their wife, other family members, a witness, whatever, cries, they're indifferent.
And if I may jump in, just as a side note, in terms of the research, because there's research suggesting that they have what we call an attenuated emotional response, so a limited emotional response. And when they've actually looked more specifically at it, it's particularly fear and remorse. So their ability to experience the emotion, fear and remorse, and to experience those emotions when they're witnessing other people presenting those emotions, suffering, is markedly diminished. They have a lot of difficulty. It's one of the fundamental deficits.
Right. I'm not looking at murderers, serial killers, or rapists.
There is such a thing as business psychopaths as well.
Well, there certainly is. And, when that research came out, I sort of had a eureka moment. And it occurred to me, for a lot of these guys, in order to be able to make the money they have to have that ability about, not caring if they screw their employees or their co-contractants, or if they do, the businessmen who do the serial bankruptcies, like Trump, and he's not the only one, have gone through a number of bankruptcies, and they're quite happy to walk away from their debts. There is no empathy for the impact on the people with whom they do business, whether these are employees or business partners or third-party creditors or even the government. I mean, I stress out at night when I owe an unpaid balance of income taxes at night, either because I'm a weirdo, but because I'm hugely aware that I live in a society where our governments are constantly in deficit. And if I owe money, I shake until I can pay it, because I know my money, for the most part, is actually going to hospitals and schools that provide services for people. I make that link in my mind because I'm not a psychopath. And I therefore want to pay my debts. I could never do what he does, Trump, to have such a cavalier disregard for his contributions to the collectivity.
I take your point. No doubt there are psychopaths that are successful in all lines of work and those that are not. I just want to make a distinction that sometimes things are not always what they appear. There are people who can be stoic, and they're not necessarily psychopathic. There's a way to cultivate a certain reticence, a certain discipline in terms of what you show others. And so there are people I've known in my life who just who can be very stone-faced. Doesn't mean that they're not feeling intensely on the inside, and that them being stone-faced has a purpose and a strategy that is actually for maybe a collective good. You never know. I could just say in my own life, I used to do a lot of boxing and mixed martial arts. And I remember the first time I sparred, my trainer told me, and I was fighting this big hairy dude, 6'4", and we started sparring, and we didn't want to punch each other in the face. So you're punching, but you're really near the face, and you're kind of missing on purpose. And he warned us about this. He says, guys, it's very normal. People don't want to punch other people in the face. It takes time to train yourself to do that. Now, you might say that that's desensitizing you and that's making you more of a killer.
Yes, the mother would say that.
No, actually, it's more about reining it in. I've never known gentler people than these professional fighters, because they've experienced it, they've gone all the way through and back, and know how to rein it in and use it only when it's appropriate or when it's necessary.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Dale, you have a very lovely point that we can't always judge people from the outside. A lot of times, and even through the course of this discussion, we're engaging in a lot of mind reading and saying there's other people that are far from us that we don't know, and we're othering them, and we're saying, I know what they're thinking of, and what they're thinking of ain't good. And these are bad things because these are bad people. And I think that this brings back the original point, which is it's helpful to empathize and to think about what other people are, to at least give other people the benefit of the doubt and consider that they are at least humans as well. And when it comes to psychopaths in the business world, I'm of two minds. One is I take your point, Dale, that we may be judging people unfairly without actually knowing what their real intentions are. And the other side is, well, look, it depends how you're measuring success. So if you're saying that business psychopaths tend to make, if the measure of success is that they make more money for their individual company, sure, that's great. If they're causing more harm to given communities, if their intentional overlookings or errors lead to gas spills and oil spills in vulnerable areas that harm local flora and fauna and people and ruin the drinking water, then really they're successful. So I think it's really a question of what our focus is.
So empathy comes in many forms, perhaps, is the way to conclude the podcast.
That's a good place, Dan.
All right. Guys, let's move on to further reading. What do you recommend on the topic of empathy?
I have a film, Gentleman's Agreement with Gregory Peck. It's a film from the 1940s. One of the, I think, the first American film to deal head-on with anti-Semitism. In it, he plays a journalist who, for a piece, impersonates a Jewish man, pretends to be Jewish, doesn't dress up in sort of Jew face, but it's a very powerful film, and I recommend people see it. And I think it's all about living in other people's skin.
I have so many different suggestions to give on this subject, but I'm going to try to rein it in. I'm going to suggest Simon Baron-Cohen's book 0 Degrees of Empathy, where he really gets into empathy and its function and its importance and just breaks down the various conditions where empathy is affected. Such as borderline personality disorder, narcissism, psychopathy, autism spectrum disorders. I think it's really a fantastic read. The other thing I'm just going to add for those of you who are looking to cultivate empathy. So as we're talking about, evidently I'm a big proponent of empathy, so I figured I'll give you guys some tools if you're interested. There's a fantastic video by Renee Brown where she gets into the difference between empathy and sympathy. And it's a beautiful video. It's a few minutes and it really breaks it down. It's really quite moving. And the other thing I'm going to suggest people to look into if they really want to cultivate their sense of empathy and connectedness is something called loving kindness meditation, otherwise known as, or other word for it is metta meditation, M like mom, ETTA. You can find guided exercises online, and there's some really interesting research about how it can really help people to be more kind, to help decrease depression, to help you feel more connected to other people, and to have a much more potentially compassionate stance to other people. So I'd really recommend that.
The book I'm going to recommend is The Drama of the Gifted Child by Dr. Alice Miller. Not only because I have a certain identification with the topic that's written about, but notably because I'd like people to read a little bit about the darker side of empathy, because this deals with what we call in today's world the hypermature, the pseudo-hypermature child, who by dint of being either more intelligent or more mature than his or her years, ends up having to be the caretaker of his or her parents and have extra empathy in order to cope. And this can be a tremendous impetus to succeed in life. I mean, that is, after all, the theme of the book, the drama of the gifted child. But at the reality, it's at a tremendous cost to the individual's well-being, because you begin to define yourself only by what you give. Your identity and your ability, your needs are not, you don't have an expectation that you're entitled to have your needs fulfilled. You exist purely to try to anticipate the needs of others and fulfill their needs.
Don't forget all the further reading links and viewing links are on the blog, thegoldwaters.ca, and you can join the conversation using the hashtag #TheGoldWaters. We'll be on Facebook and Twitter soon, so do stay tuned for that. And 6 previous episodes as well. If you want to listen to those and share and comment on your social networks, please feel free to do so. Not asking for any money, so it's the only way really that you can support the podcast. If you are enjoying these discussions, please share and also rate on iTunes and other platforms. Which episode is your favorite, guys? Looking back on the 6 so far, any one that you think is your perfect Goldwater episode that people should check out?
Tech ethics.
Yeah, I like that one.
I would have to say my personal favorite would have to be this conversation with my family.
Oh.
This really hits a note, and it's a subject, a topic that's really close to my heart.
Yeah, I would also say this one was really touching. I was actually kind of worried going into this that, the center would not hold and we would end up at each other's throats. I had this kind of like opposite sort of maybe expectation most people would have, that it would become a battle of who has the bigger heart and like throwing it around and blood would be everywhere. But we made it through, and I love you guys.
Aww, I love you too, Daniel.
I love you too, my little children.
Thanks, Goldwaters.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Dan, for bringing us together.
Great episode.
You guys are gonna have fun with editing. Boom, boom.
Provocateur.media.